Today we're unboxing an iPad mini first generation that should be running its original software version, iOS 6. I got this on eBay for around $50. So let's go ahead and get it opened up now. Okay, and here is the iPad. At first glance, it looks like this is in decent condition. I don't see very many scratches on the display, but I am seeing a dent here in the bottom corner. And it looks like there is a dent in the top corner as well. And here on the back panel, this looks to be really dirty. But we do have a cellular model here. You can tell that by the plastic window here on the top of the device. And also by the SIM card slot on the side. Let's wipe off this back panel so we can get a better look at the true condition. Okay, and now the device is looking much better. Let's see if this iPad has any battery power. Okay, looks like it needs to charge, but this is definitely the iOS 6 interface. Okay, well I have the iPad powered up here and this is definitely running iOS 6. So let's slide to unlock now. And there we go, we are met with the gorgeous iOS 6 home screen. Let's head into settings and see which version we have. Okay, looks like we have 6.1.3 here. I believe that was actually the last version of iOS 6 for this iPad mini. And we can also see that this is a 32GB model. This 32GB configuration was pretty rare, as most users went for the base model 16GB. So let's talk about what this first generation iPad mini was. This iPad was released in November 2012 alongside the full-size 4th generation iPad. The 4th generation iPad had a 9.7-inch display, and it used the same design that we had seen since the 2011 iPad 2. So this iPad mini here was the first iPad that did not use the 9.7-inch form factor. This used a 7.9-inch display. And it's really interesting because Apple used the exact same display resolution on this as the iPad 2. So this has a 1024 by 768 display. The iPad 2 had 132 pixels per inch, while this iPad had 163. So here's a close-up look at the display on this device. It was definitely not Retina quality, but it was noticeably sharper than the iPad 2. So although Apple did use a scaled-down display from another iPad, the design was all new. And the new design that the iPad mini brought was really fantastic. You can see here with the 4th generation iPad that the aluminum design kind of tapers toward the edge. So while this iPad felt more angular to hold, the iPad mini felt a little bit more rounded. The iPad mini brought a design cue from the iPhone 5 with this diamond chamfered edge. And I think the design of the iPad mini was more comfortable to hold in the hand. Of course, it's a much smaller tablet, so that makes it inherently more comfortable. But I think the tapered edge on the 4th generation iPad just feels a little bit more pointy and awkward to hold. Apple really reduced the left and right bezel size of this iPad in portrait orientation. Those bezels are just a fraction of the size that the 4th generation iPad had. And that also played a big role in how comfortable this was to hold, as you weren't reaching your fingers across such large bezels to use the touchscreen. This design was scaled up and used in the iPad Air in 2013. And it was also brought to the base model iPads in 2017. And this basic design format lasted all the way through the 9th generation iPad that was just discontinued in 2024. This was the first iPad to feature stereo speakers. And it also used the new at the time Lightning connector from the iPhone 5. This iPad was powered by the A5 chip, also used in the iPad 2, iPhone 4S, and the iPod Touch 5th generation. And it is important to note that when this iPad was new, that chip was one generation behind, as Apple had just launched the A6 chip with the iPhone 5. And the iPad 4th generation announced at the same time as this iPad received the A6 chip with the A6X variant. This iPad was priced relatively low at the time, however. It started at only $329 for a 16GB model. Later iPad minis like the Mini 2, 3, 4, and so on started at $399. You could get the iPad mini in a white and silver color or a black and slate color. This black and slate color option here was only available for 1 year. It was replaced with space gray in 2013, as the paint on this would often chip off and reveal the silver underneath. That base model 16GB unit was actually sold new by Apple all the way through mid-2015. It saw price cuts all the way down to $249 by then. So now let's take a second to talk about iOS 6 on this iPad specifically. As you may know, iOS 6 was the last version to use Apple's classic skeuomorphic design. And just in case you're not familiar with what skeuomorphism is, it's when a digital interface mimics real-world objects. So take, for example, the photo booth icon here. It actually shows a stool with a curtain depicting a real-life photo booth. The Notes application looks like an actual notepad. The Game Center application kind of mimics a pool table, with these wooden edge details and this felt look in the center. And that classic skeuomorphic design that we had with iOS 6 in 2012 was completely replaced with a flat and modern look with iOS 7 in 2013. So iOS 6 was definitely the last of its kind. This clock application was actually new for iPads running iOS 6. Previously, in iOS 5 and older, the iPad simply did not have this application. The Apple Maps application was also new for iOS 6. And this application no longer loads here in 2025. But this was when Apple first shifted away from using Google Maps as their default application. There were tons of complaints with the initial rollout of Apple Maps. And those complaints range from minor inconveniences like the 3D flyover view not displaying an image properly, to really serious problems like misnavigating users who were using the turn-by-turn direction feature. Apple actually released a public apology for this. But one of the really well-known software engineers at the time named Scott Forstall would not sign this apology, and that ultimately led to his departure from Apple. Thankfully though, Apple really got their Maps application together, and of course it works perfectly today. As nostalgic as iOS 6 is though, there are a few drawbacks I can think of. One of which being the really old-fashioned multitasking. You only see a preview of the application icon, and to close them out you have to hold down and then press these really small minus buttons. This was made so much better in iOS 7 as you would receive full previews of the application windows. And to close them out, you would simply swipe upward. Another pitfall of iOS 6 was the lack of control center. You could get to some basic controls by accessing the multitasking screen and swiping to the left. On the iPad here, you would get brightness controls, the rotation lock controls, as well as audio controls. However, the iPhone did not have the brightness control. And this was really improved with iOS 7, where every device had a fully featured control center available with just a swipe. Here in 2025, there isn't a ton you can do with iOS 6 without jailbreaking. The App Store no longer works, but I believe Siri works, so let's try that out now. What's up?
Hello, I don't think we've been introduced.
Tell me a joke.
How do we know that hot is faster than cold? Because you can catch a cold.
Okay, yeah, well, Siri is definitely working here on iOS 6. And Siri is definitely fun to play around with, but I would much prefer to have the App Store working on iOS 6. I also wanted to show off the multitasking gestures here on this iPad. So you can use a 5-finger pinch to close an application, you can swipe up with 4 fingers to access multitasking, or you can swipe left or right with 4 fingers to go between applications. Here is the wallpaper selection for iOS 6. You had 23 images to choose from. This blue ripple that is infamously blurry is the default, and you had a lot of other nostalgic wallpapers like these raindrops, which were the default for iOS 4 and 5. And I feel like this denim wallpaper just screams Steve Jobs era. This iPad would only receive 3 major software updates with iOS 7, 8, and 9. Performance, however, really began struggling with iOS 8 and especially with iOS 9. So this does go down in history as one of the less gracefully aging iPads. The iPad Mini 2, released just 1 year after this one, received software updates all the way through iOS 12 in 2018. So that pretty much concludes my look at this first generation iPad mini that is stuck in 2012 running iOS 6.1.3. I'm really happy to have this device in my collection, especially because it's a white and silver model. Any device with a white display bezel is super nostalgic to me, and I wish Apple would make more devices with them. Be sure to get subscribed and hit the notification bell if you want to see more content like this. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.